February 22nd, 2026, a date that will be remembered in the history of Mexico's war on drugs, a date that sent shockwaves across North America and beyond, a date when one of the most powerful, most feared, most wanted drug lords in the world took his last breath. Nemesio Rubén Oseguera Cervantes, El Mencho, the leader of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, a man with a $15 million bounty on his head from the United States government, a man designated as a terrorist, a man responsible for flooding American streets with fentanyl, heroin, and cocaine, a man whose cartel was described by the U.S. government as one of the 5 most dangerous criminal organizations in the world. He's dead, killed by Mexican military forces in a pre-dawn raid in the mountains of Jalisco, shot, wounded, and dead before they could get him to Mexico City. But his death didn't bring peace. It brought chaos, immediate, violent, widespread chaos that turned multiple Mexican states into war zones. That trapped American tourists in beach resorts. That shut down airports. That killed 25 members of Mexico's National Guard in brutal retaliatory attacks. That set the entire country on edge. This is the story of how El Mencho died, how the Mexican military, with intelligence from the United States, finally tracked down and killed the man who had eluded capture for decades, the man who built one of the most powerful criminal empires in the Western Hemisphere, the man whose organization earned billions of dollars in revenue from drug trafficking and human smuggling. But it's also the story of what happened next. The immediate explosion of violence, the coordinated attacks across a dozen Mexican states, the burning vehicles blocking highways, the convenience stores set ablaze, the tourists trapped in their hotels, the flights canceled, the shelters issued, the body count rising. And it's the story of what might come next: the power vacuum, the succession war, the potential civil war within the CJNG as regional commanders fight for control, the possible territorial expansion by the rival Sinaloa cartel, the domino effect across Latin America, the impact on the United States, and the war on drugs. Before we continue, a content warning. This video discusses organized crime, drug trafficking, and military operations that resulted in casualties. While we'll cover these events in detail for educational purposes, we will not show or describe graphic violence. All information comes from verified news sources and official government statements. Viewer discretion is advised. This is the full story. From El Mencho's rise from poverty to his death in the mountains, from the pre-dawn raid to the chaos that followed, from the celebration in Washington to the concern about what comes next. Let me start at the beginning, not February 22nd, 2026, but decades earlier, in a small, poor, rural community in the Mexican state of Michoacán, where a boy named Nemesio was born into a life that seemed to offer no escape from poverty. Nemesio Rubén Oseguera Cervantes was born on July 17, 1966, in the rural community of Culotitlan, in the municipality of Aguililla, Michoacán. His family was poor, desperately poor, the kind of poverty that's hard to escape in rural Mexico, the kind where opportunity doesn't exist, where education is a luxury, where survival is the daily struggle. His first name was cited in different records as both Rubén and Nemesio. Some sources state that his birth name was actually Rubén, but that he changed it to Nemesio in memory of his godfather. Whatever the truth of his given name, he would eventually become known by his nickname, El Mencho, a diminutive that derives from Nemesio. Young Nemesio grew up working the land. His family grew avocados. It was hard work, physical labor under the Mexican sun for little money. He dropped out of primary school, elementary school. He never finished his basic education, and like so many young men from poor rural communities in Mexico, he saw only one path to a better life: migration to the United States. In the 1980s, as a young man, Nemesio illegally crossed the border into the United States. He settled in Northern California, and for a time, he tried to make an honest living. He worked in construction, he worked in agriculture, jobs that didn't require documentation, jobs that paid cash, jobs that millions of undocumented immigrants take to support themselves and send money back home to their families in Mexico. But at some point, Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes made a choice that would set him on a path that would eventually make him one of the most wanted men in the world. He got involved in drug trafficking, small scale at first, moving marijuana, moving heroin, working for others, learning the trade, learning the business, learning how to move product, how to avoid law enforcement, how to make money, real money. In 1992, Nemesio was arrested by U.S. authorities in California. He was convicted on federal heroin charges. He served time in a U.S. federal prison. And then, like many convicted drug traffickers, he was deported back to Mexico, back to Michoacan, back to the poverty he had tried to escape. But he didn't stay in poverty, because by this point, Nemesio had connections. He had experience. He had knowledge of how drugs moved from Mexico to the United States. He had knowledge of the business, and he had ambition. He returned to Mexico and became involved with local criminal organizations. At first, he worked with groups that were relatively small, local operations, regional groups, but he was smart, he was ruthless, and he was building something. Around 2009 or 2010, something significant happened that would shape the rest of El Mencho's life and the future of organized crime in Mexico. A powerful cartel called Los Zetas, which had originally been formed by former Mexican Special Forces soldiers, was expanding aggressively into new territories. They were brutal, exceptionally violent. They used military tactics because many of their members had military training, and they were pushing into the state of Jalisco and surrounding areas. Los Zetas' expansion threatened local criminal groups and local populations, and in response, several groups in the region came together to fight back. They called themselves Los Mata Zetas, the Zeta Killers. It was a defensive alliance at first, a coalition of criminal groups and even some civilians who were tired of Los Zetas' brutal tactics, their extortion, their violence against ordinary people. Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, El Mencho, was part of this coalition, and he quickly rose to prominence within it. He was smart. He was strategic. He understood that to fight Los Zetas, you needed organization. You needed discipline. You needed to be just as ruthless, just as willing to use extreme force. Los Mata Zetas fought a brutal war against Los Zetas, and they won. They pushed Los Zetas out of Jalisco and surrounding areas. They consolidated control. They eliminated their enemies, and in the process, they became powerful themselves. And then they did something interesting. They rebranded. They changed their name from Los Mata Zetas to something that sounded more legitimate, more powerful, more like a next-generation criminal organization. They called themselves the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, Cartel de Jalisco Nueva Generación, CJNG, and Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, El Mencho, was their leader. This is where El Mencho's story truly begins, because what he built over the next 15 years was extraordinary, not in a good way, extraordinary in its scope, in its brutality, in its reach, in its power. El Mencho didn't just want to control drug trafficking in Jalisco, he wanted to control drug trafficking across Mexico. He wanted to challenge the Sinaloa cartel, which had been the dominant cartel in Mexico for decades. The cartel led by Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, the cartel that controlled the most lucrative smuggling routes into the United States. And El Mencho pursued this goal with a strategy that was as brutal as it was effective. First, territorial expansion. The CJNG under El Mencho's leadership didn't just defend their territory. They aggressively expanded into new territories. They moved into other states. They pushed out rival cartels. They took control of smuggling routes. They took control of ports where cocaine arrived from South America. They took control of drug production facilities. They took control of everything they could. Second, corruption. El Mencho understood that you couldn't run a criminal organization of this scale without corrupting government officials, police, military, politicians, judges, everyone. The CJNG under his leadership spent enormous amounts of money bribing officials at every level of government. Local police who would look the other way, state police who would provide protection, federal officials who would provide intelligence, military officers who would warn them of operations, politicians who would shield them from investigation. Third, violence. Extreme, brutal, public violence. And this is what made the CJNG under El Mencho different from other cartels. Because while all cartels use violence, El Mencho's approach to violence was strategic. It was performative. It was designed to send a message so terrifying that rivals would think twice about opposing him. The CJNG became notorious for extreme public displays of violence, acts designed to terrorize rivals and civilians alike. This wasn't random violence. This was calculated terror, designed to dominate rivals quickly and discourage resistance. Security analyst Chris Dalby noted that what was once an aberration became almost daily news under the CJNG's reign. The CJNG, according to security experts, fundamentally changed the nature of cartel violence in Mexico through systematic public intimidation. What was once rare became commonplace under their control. Analyst Chris Dalby described their strategy, saying, quote, "He trained them almost like Genghis Khan in their approach to conquest. They would eliminate opposition and use that as a warning. This brutal approach helped the cartel expand rapidly across multiple states, but it also meant constant violent confrontation with rivals and government forces. That approach helped the cartel grow quickly across multiple states, but it also meant constant confrontation, constant war with rivals, constant war with the government. Fourth, business diversification. The CJNG under El Mencho didn't just traffic drugs, they trafficked humans, migrants trying to reach the United States. They charged fees for safe passage. They controlled routes. They made millions from people desperate to cross the border. They also got into other businesses, illegal mining, stealing fuel from government pipelines and selling it on the black market, extortion of businesses, kidnapping for ransom. Any criminal enterprise that could generate revenue, the CJNG pursued it. And fifth, international expansion. El Mencho didn't limit the CJNG to Mexico. He built international networks, connections with cocaine producers in Colombia, distribution networks in Ecuador, partnerships with criminal organizations in Central America, smuggling routes across the Pacific, markets in Asia, markets in Europe. The CJNG became a truly global criminal organization. By the time of his death in 2026, the CJNG was operating in dozens of countries. It was estimated to generate billions of dollars in annual revenue. Billions. The US government described it as one of the 5 most dangerous criminal organizations in the world, and El Mencho was at the center of it all. The undisputed leader, the strategist, the one making the decisions, the one everyone feared, but he was also incredibly elusive. Unlike some cartel leaders who lived flashy lifestyles and were occasionally photographed at parties or events, El Mencho was a ghost. There were very few known photographs of him. He rarely appeared in public. He moved constantly. He used body doubles. He communicated through intermediaries. He trusted almost no one. And for years, he evaded capture. The Mexican government tried. The US government tried. They offered enormous rewards. $15 million from the United States, 300 million pesos from Mexico. They designated him as a fugitive. They indicted him multiple times in US courts on drug trafficking charges. They designated the CJNG as a foreign terrorist organization in February 2025, but they couldn't catch him. He was too careful, too paranoid, too protected, until February 22, 2026. So what changed? How did Mexican forces finally locate and kill a man who had eluded capture for so long? According to reports from multiple sources, it came down to intelligence, human intelligence, information about one of El Mencho's close associates, someone in his inner circle, someone he trusted, someone who made a mistake or was betrayed. The United States had been sharing intelligence with Mexico for months. President Trump had been pressuring Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum to take more aggressive action against the cartels, to target the leadership, to disrupt their operations, to stop the flow of fentanyl into the United States, which was killing tens of thousands of Americans every year. The US had signals intelligence, electronic surveillance. They were monitoring communications. They were tracking movements. They were building a picture of where El Mencho might be. But signals intelligence alone isn't enough. You need to confirm. You need to know exactly where someone is at a specific moment. And for that, you need human intelligence. Someone gave up information about a close associate of El Mencho. According to Mexican Defense Secretary Ricardo Trevilla Trejo, their investigation into El Mencho's network had led them to a key person who could help access his hideout. A trusted man of one of El Mencho's romantic partners. That associate led authorities to a location, a property in the mountain town of Tapalpa in Jalisco state. Tapalpa is in central western Mexico. It's a small town, population around 20,000. It's in the mountains. It's relatively isolated. It's the kind of place where someone could hide, where someone could feel safe. On February 20th, acting on this new intelligence, Mexican authorities began surrounding the site in Tapalpa, where El Mencho was believed to be hiding. The following day, El Mencho's romantic partner left the cabin complex on the outskirts of Tapalpa, but the drug lord remained at the hideout with his security detail. Mexican military intelligence confirmed his presence through surveillance. They watched the property. They identified vehicles. They identified people coming and going. And they determined that yes, El Mencho was there. Using eyewitness video captured during the operation and later verified by CNN, Investigators pinpointed El Mencho's likely location in a wooded area which shelters several small gated compounds just over 3 miles southwest of Tapalpa. The site, a vacation rental known as Cabañas La Loma, is near the Tapalpa Country Club down a long, remote driveway. Interestingly, Cabañas La Loma had been sanctioned by the U.S. Treasury in 2015 and again in 2017 for providing material assistance to the drug trafficking activities of the Jalisco cartel. The property had been on the U.S. government's radar for years, and they decided to act fast, before he could move again, before the intelligence went stale, before he disappeared back into the shadows. Special forces, backed by the National Guard, military aircraft and helicopters, sealed off the area before dawn on February 22nd. This wasn't local police. This wasn't even federal police. This was the military. Mexican army troops, elite units, heavily armed, supported by helicopter. This was a full military operation against one of the most dangerous men in Mexico. They moved in under cover of darkness. They surrounded the property, and then they went in. What happened next was hours of intense gunfire. El Mencho's security team was heavily armed. They had automatic weapons. They had armored vehicles. They had rocket launchers. Yes, rocket launchers. The kind that can shoot down helicopters. The kind that can destroy armored vehicles. Cartel gunmen opened fire as soldiers advanced, and they fought back, hard. They knew that if El Mencho was captured, it was over, for him and for them. So they fought like their lives depended on it, because they did. Eyewitness footage verified by CNN shows dozens of uniformed people in armored vehicles advancing up a slope toward the site. In other footage, filmed farther down the driveway, automatic gunfire can be heard, while a third video taken at the same time shows thick black smoke emanating from the site. Security forces returned fire. Several suspected CJNG members were killed in the initial exchange. 4 people at the location died in the firefight. El Mencho and members of his inner circle fled to a nearby wooded cabin within the complex, where a second firefight erupted. The Mexican military statement said that during the operation, troops came under fire, heavy fire, and they returned fire. 4 members of the CJNG security team were killed at the scene. Soldiers eventually found a wounded El Mencho alongside 2 bodyguards. 3 people were wounded. One of them was Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, El Mencho himself, shot, seriously wounded. 2 others were also wounded, and 2 other people at the location were arrested, taken into custody. Mexican troops also seized weapons at the scene. Lots of weapons. The statement mentioned armored vehicles, rocket launchers, capable of downing aircraft and destroying armored vehicles, according to the official statement. Heavy weaponry that you don't normally see outside of military conflicts. 3 members of the Mexican armed forces were wounded in the operation, but they survived. They were transported to receive medical treatment and were reported to be stable. But El Mencho and 2 others were too seriously wounded to treat at the scene, so the decision was made to transport them by military helicopter to Mexico City, to the capital, where there are better medical facilities, where they could potentially be interrogated, where they could be secured in a high-security facility. The helicopter took off, with El Mencho and the 2 other wounded prisoners on board, and Mexican troops as guards, flying from the mountains of Jalisco toward Mexico City. But Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes never made it to Mexico City. His wounds were too severe. He lost too much blood. And somewhere over central Mexico, in that military helicopter, one of the most wanted men in the world took his last breath. El Mencho died en route to Mexico City from his gunshot wounds. The other 2 wounded prisoners also died during the flight. The Mexican Defense Secretariat announced the death on Sunday, February 22, 2026. They confirmed that Nemesio Rubén Oseguera Cervantes, known as El Mencho, the leader of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, had been killed during a military operation in Tapalpa, Jalisco. The White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, issued a statement Sunday night confirming that the United States provided intelligence support to the Mexican government in order to assist with an operation that resulted in El Mencho's death. She added, "President Trump has been very clear. The United States will ensure narco-terrorists sending deadly drugs to our homeland are forced to face the wrath of justice they have long deserved." U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Christopher Landau posted on X, calling El Mencho one of the bloodiest and most ruthless drug kingpins, and saying his death was a great development for Mexico, the U.S., Latin America, and the world. In Mexico City, President Claudia Sheinbaum called it a triumph for her government, a major victory in the war against organized crime, the biggest prize yet in her administration's efforts to crack down on the cartels, the most significant blow against a Mexican criminal organization in years. But the celebration didn't last long, because within hours, all hell broke loose. News of El Mencho's death spread quickly, through the CJNG's communication networks, through social media, through WhatsApp groups, through word of mouth in communities controlled by the cartel, and the response was immediate. Cartel commanders across multiple states received orders, or perhaps they acted on their own initiative. Either way, the response was coordinated, organized, and brutal. Starting Sunday afternoon and continuing into Sunday night, suspected CJNG members launched coordinated reprisals across multiple Mexican states. At least a dozen states saw violence. Jalisco, obviously, the cartel's home base, but also Colima, Michoacán, Nayarit, Guanajuato, Tamaulipas, Guerrero, Nuevo León, Baja California, and others. The tactics were the same across all these states. Attackers torched convenience stores, specifically OXXO stores, which are the most common convenience store chain in Mexico. They set them on fire, burned them to the ground. Why? To spread fear, to show they could strike anywhere, to hurt businesses, to hurt the economy. They torched vehicles and used them to block major highways. This is called a narco bloqueo in Mexico, a narco blockade. You set a truck on fire in the middle of a highway, and suddenly that highway is impassable. Traffic stops, commerce stops, people are trapped, The tactic has been used by cartels for years, but on February 22nd, it happened on a scale rarely seen. At least 85 roadblocks were reported on Sunday alone. 85. Across 7 states. Burning vehicles blocking major highways and roads, cutting off cities from each other, cutting off supplies, creating chaos. They also attacked gas stations, setting them on fire, creating massive fireballs visible for miles, sending smoke billowing into the air, creating scenes that looked like a war zone. In Guadalajara, the capital of Jalisco State and Mexico's second-largest city with a population of about 5 million people, the city essentially shut down. Gunfire was reported in multiple neighborhoods. Armed men, believed to be CJNG members, were seen in the streets. Businesses closed, schools closed, people were told to stay in their homes, the streets emptied. Guadalajara became a ghost town on Sunday night. Videos circulated on social media showing convenience stores on fire, gas stations burning, vehicles blocking highways, armed men in masks. It looked like the city was under attack, because it was. In Puerto Vallarta, a Pacific coastal resort town popular with American and Canadian tourists, the situation became dire. The city is in Jalisco State. It's a major tourist destination. Beautiful beaches, luxury resorts, normally a safe place for tourists. But on Sunday, suspected cartel members set up roadblocks in Puerto Vallarta. They set vehicles on fire. They attacked businesses. And suddenly, thousands of tourists, many of them Americans, were trapped in their hotels. They couldn't leave. It wasn't safe to go outside. Flights were being canceled. Video obtained by CNN showed multiple fires burning and plumes of smoke rising across Puerto Vallarta. All taxi and rideshare services in Puerto Vallarta were suspended. You couldn't get to the airport even if there were flights. Hotels went into lockdown mode. Guests were told to stay inside. Don't leave your room. Don't go to the beach. Don't go to restaurants. Stay inside until we tell you it's safe. Footage captured at major airports and verified by CNN showed distant smoke and panicked travelers. At Guadalajara's international airport, travelers took cover near a jetway and sprinted through the terminal. Another video showed a large group of people being escorted by uniformed employees across the tarmac of Puerto Vallarta's main airport. The U.S. Embassy in Mexico issued an urgent advisory. They told U.S. citizens in 9 Mexican states to shelter in place. Stay where you are. Do not travel. Lock your doors. Wait for further instructions. The 9 states were Jalisco, Tamaulipas, Michoacán, Guerrero, Nuevo León, Colima, Nayarit, Guanajuato, and Baja California. Think about that. 9 states, a huge portion of Mexico, including border states like Baja California and Tamaulipas, including tourist destinations like Jalisco, all under a shelter-in-place advisory from the U.S. Embassy. The U.S. State Department warned Americans to avoid these areas due to ongoing security operations. They said roadblocks had impacted airline operations, with some domestic and international flights canceled in both Guadalajara and Puerto Vallarta. Several airlines, including Delta Airlines, Alaska Airlines, American Airlines, and Air Canada, canceled flights to Puerto Vallarta and Guadalajara as a result of the violence. Southwest Airlines told CNN that it wouldn't have any operations at Puerto Vallarta International Airport on Monday, given the uncertainty on the ground. And it wasn't just Americans who were affected. Canadian tourists were trapped, European tourists, Mexican citizens trying to travel. Everyone was stuck. The violence had paralyzed large parts of the country. In Mexicali, the capital of Baja California state, which borders the United States, roadblocks went up. Mexicali is right on the U.S. border. It's across from Calexico, California. And suddenly there were burning vehicles blocking roads in a city right on the U.S. border. The violence was literally at America's doorstep. In Tecate, another border town, local officials told residents not to leave their homes. Shelter in place. The entire town went into lockdown. This wasn't just random violence. This was organized. This was coordinated. This was the CJNG demonstrating its power, demonstrating that even without El Mencho, they could bring the country to its knees. Security analyst David Saucedo told CNN, "For now, it appears all the main CJNG commanders have united to launch this attack against the Mexican state, aiming to paralyze economic activity and impose a national and international image cost on the government." Paralyze economic activity. That's exactly what they did. Highways blocked means trucks can't move goods, can't deliver supplies. Businesses can't operate. The economy stops. Tourists trapped means canceled reservations, canceled flights, international news coverage showing chaos, terrible publicity for Mexico, bad for tourism, bad for business, bad for investment, impose a national and international image cost. Mission accomplished. The news coverage was extensive. CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera. Every major news organization covering the chaos in Mexico, showing the burning vehicles, the trapped tourists, the ghost town cities. Mexico looked like it was descending into chaos. And this was particularly concerning because Mexico is scheduled to host the FIFA World Cup in 2026, just months away. And Guadalajara is one of the host cities, one of the cities where matches will be played, where hundreds of thousands of international visitors will come, where the eyes of the world will be watching. Guadalajara is scheduled to host 4 matches in June, including one featuring Mexico's national team. Authorities expect around 3 million visitors, and now Guadalajara had just been turned into a war zone. That's a terrible look. That's a major concern for FIFA, for sponsors, for teams, for fans planning to travel, for the Mexican government. But the violence on Sunday was just the beginning, because the CJNG had more planned, and they had identified specific targets. Mexican authorities announced that they had identified the person who organized the coordinated attacks on Sunday, a senior CJNG figure known as El Tuli. His real name wasn't immediately released, but authorities described him as El Mencho's right-hand man, his most trusted lieutenant, and a top financial operator within the cartel. El Tuli was in charge of money laundering operations, moving the billions of dollars the cartel made from drug trafficking, buying legitimate businesses to clean the money, purchasing property, investing in legal enterprises. He was the money man, and apparently also a military commander. Authorities said El Tuli orchestrated the roadblocks on Sunday. He ordered the arson attacks. He organized the assaults on government facilities. And he did something even more disturbing. According to Mexican authorities, El Tuli offered a bounty, 20,000 pesos, about $1,100 for the killing of each member of the Mexican military. Think about that. A bounty on soldiers. Kill a soldier, get paid. That's not just revenge. That's an incentive system for violence. That's putting a price on the heads of men and women serving in Mexico's armed forces. And it worked. By Monday, February 23rd, the death toll among Mexican security forces had risen dramatically. 25 members of Mexico's National Guard were killed. 25. In various clashes with CJNG gunmen across Jalisco state. The National Guard is a militarized police force created in 2019. They're supposed to be better trained and better equipped than regular police. They're supposed to be able to handle cartel violence. But on February 22nd and 23rd, 25 of them were killed in what appears to have been targeted attacks. This is an astonishing number. 25 killed in just 2 days. That's more than most military operations. That's a significant blow to Mexico's security forces. That's a message. You kill our leader, we kill your people. An eye for an eye, multiplied by 25. Mexican Defense Secretary General Ricardo Trevilla Trejo confirmed that 8 members of the CJNG were killed during the initial military operation that resulted in El Mencho's death. 4 killed in the raid itself, 3 including El Mencho who died of their wounds, and 1 other member killed later. 8 cartel members dead on the government's side of the ledger, but 25 National Guard members dead on the cartel's side. The math wasn't in the government's favor, and El Tuli wasn't done. Even as security forces were reeling from the attacks, even as they were trying to restore order, El Tuli was still out there, still organizing, still commanding. Mexican authorities made finding him a top priority. They tracked him through intelligence, through informants, through signals intelligence. And on Sunday, the same day as El Mencho's death, they located him. El Tuli was in El Grullo, a small town about 180 kilometers, roughly 112 miles southwest of Guadalajara. It's in Jalisco state, rural, relatively isolated, the kind of place where cartel figures often hide. Security forces moved in. They tried to arrest him, but El Tuli wasn't going quietly. He attempted to flee, and he opened fire on the officers trying to apprehend him. The officers returned fire, and in the ensuing gun battle, El Tuli was killed, shot dead. El Mencho's right-hand man, the financial operator, the man who organized the retaliatory attacks, dead on the same day as his boss. 2 top CJNG leaders killed on the same day, El Mencho and El Tuli. That's a significant blow to the organization. That's removing not just the head, but also one of the key operators. That's disrupting command and control. That's creating uncertainty within the cartel about who's in charge now. Mexican Security Secretary Omar Garcia Harfuch said authorities would remain very attentive to any reaction or restructuring within the cartel. They were reinforcing security in the area. They were preparing for possible further violence, because killing 2 top leaders in one day could trigger even more chaos. By Monday, February 23rd, Mexican authorities announced they had arrested more than 70 people across 7 states in connection with the violence. 70 arrests in just 2 days. People suspected of participating in the roadblocks, the arson attacks, the assaults on security forces. 70 people in custody. But tens of thousands of CJNG members remain free. The organization wasn't defeated. It was wounded, it was disrupted, but it wasn't destroyed. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum attempted to reassure the public on Monday. Peace, security, and normalcy are being maintained in Mexico, she said, adding that the most important thing right now is to guarantee peace and security for the entire population. She urged residents to remain calm, but calm was hard to find. Because the question everyone was asking was, what happens next? What happens to the CJNG without El Mencho? What happens to Mexico's security situation? What happens to the flow of drugs into the United States? What happens to the fragile stability in regions controlled by the cartel? Let's start with the most immediate question. Who takes over the CJNG? This is where things get complicated. Because unlike some criminal organizations that have clear lines of succession, the CJNG under El Mencho didn't have an obvious heir. El Mencho's family was heavily involved in the organization, but most of them are in prison. His older brother, Abraham Oseguera Cervantes, known as Don Rodo, was regarded as a founder of the CJNG. He was vital to the cartel's money laundering operations. He helped purchase properties for the organization. He worked with notary public offices to manage changes of ownership of properties he bought for El Mencho. But Don Rodo is in prison. He was recaptured by Mexican authorities in February 2025, exactly 1 year before El Mencho's death. And as of February 2026, he was still in Mexican custody, so he can't take over. He's locked up. El Mencho's son, Rubén Oseguera González, known as El Menchito, was being groomed to take over. He was involved in the organization. He was learning the business. He was supposed to be the next generation, the heir to the empire. But El Menchito was arrested, and he's currently in a U.S. federal prison. He was extradited to the United States and is facing drug trafficking charges. He's not getting out anytime soon. He can't take over from a prison cell in America. El Mencho's daughter, Jessica Johanna Oseguera González, was also arrested. She's in U.S. custody as well, also facing charges, also not available to take over the organization, so the immediate family is out. Brother in prison in Mexico, son in prison in the United States, daughter in prison in the United States. None of them can lead the organization from behind bars. What about El Mencho's stepson? According to reports, El Mencho married into a family with connections to organized crime. His wife, or ex-wife, Rosalinda Gonzalez Valencia, comes from a family involved in drug trafficking. El Mencho separated from her in 2018, but during their marriage he had a stepson, Juan Carlos Valencia Gonzalez, known as El Pelon. U.S. intelligence, specifically the Director of National Intelligence's National Counterterrorism Center, considered El Pelon to be El Mencho's de facto second-in-command at the time of El Mencho's death. That sounds promising. The number 2 guy, the heir apparent. But there's a problem. According to David Saucedo, a Mexico City-based security consultant, El Pelon lacks influence among other cartel commanders. He's technically the second-in-command because of his relationship to El Mencho. He's family, but he doesn't have the respect. He doesn't have the loyalty. He doesn't have the power base among the regional commanders who actually control territory and operations. There's also El Mencho's son-in-law, Julio Alberto Castillo Rodriguez, known as El Chorro. He's been designated as a CJNG leader as well. He's involved in operations, he has some authority, but again, it's not clear if he has the influence to take over the entire organization. So we have a situation where there's no clear successor. No one with the authority, the power, the respect, and the freedom to step into El Mencho's shoes and take command of an organization that operates across dozens of countries and generates billions of dollars in revenue. And that creates a vacuum, a power vacuum. And in criminal organizations, power vacuums are dangerous, very dangerous, because they lead to conflict, internal conflict. As different factions, different regional commanders, different ambitious lieutenants all decide they should be the one in charge. Analysts are already predicting a succession war within the CJNG. David Saucedo told CNN, "In the case of the CJNG, a similar scenario is expected. Commanders entering a succession war to determine who will take control of the organization." He's referring to what happened with the Sinaloa cartel after their leader, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, was arrested and extradited to the United States. The Sinaloa cartel had been one of the most powerful and most stable cartels in Mexico for decades. But when El Chapo was removed, it triggered a civil war within the cartel. Different factions fought for control. El Chapo's sons, known as Los Chapitos, fought to maintain their power. Other commanders challenged them. The violence was intense. Hundreds, possibly thousands, were killed in the fighting between Sinaloa factions, and it's still not fully resolved. The Sinaloa cartel is still fractured, still fighting internally. John Holman, reporting for Al Jazeera from Mexico City, said, "There is no obvious successor to Oseguera. His brother is in a U.S. prison, and his son, called El Menchito, is also in prison, as is his daughter. We could now see different regional bosses in the cartel start disputing for power. We saw this happen before. When El Chapo was arrested, it eventually sparked a civil war between the different Sinaloa factions. A civil war within the CJNG. That means CJNG members fighting other CJNG members. Commanders in one state fighting commanders in another state. Battles over territory, over smuggling routes, over drug production facilities, over money, over power. And that violence doesn't just affect cartel members, it affects civilians, innocent people caught in the crossfire, families displaced from their homes because their town becomes a battlefield, businesses destroyed, communities terrorized. Miguel Alfonso Meza, director of Defensorx, a Mexican civil organization dedicated to human rights, told Al Jazeera, "Panic spread among many people after El Mencho's death, and that panic is justified, because history shows that when major cartel leaders fall, violence increases. Not just immediately, as we saw with the roadblocks and attacks on Sunday and Monday, but for months or even years afterwards as the organization fragments and fights over who takes control. But it's not just internal fighting within the CJNG that's a concern. It's also the opportunity this creates for rival cartels, specifically the Sinaloa cartel. The CJNG and the Sinaloa cartel have been rivals for years. They've fought for control of drug trafficking routes. They've fought for control of ports where cocaine arrives from South America. They've fought for control of border crossings into the United States. They've fought for territory in multiple Mexican states. According to Insight Crime, which tracks organized crime in Latin America, the CJNG and Sinaloa cartel dispute territorial control for various drug trafficking routes in central and northern Mexico. One area of intense competition is Mexicali, the capital of Baja California state, which borders the United States. Roadblocks were erected there by cartel factions after El Mencho's death. The violence that erupted on Sunday was partly a show of force by the CJNG, a message to rivals. We're still here. We're still powerful. Don't try to take our territory. But the Sinaloa cartel is watching. They know the CJNG is wounded. They know there's no clear leader. They know there's going to be internal fighting. And they're thinking, this is our opportunity. This is when we can expand. This is when we can take territory from them. The two cartels are also competing in Chiapas, a state on Mexico's southern border with Guatemala. They're fighting for control of migrant smuggling routes, because trafficking migrants has become a multi-billion-dollar business. People from Central America, South America, even Asia and Africa trying to reach the United States. Cartels control the routes, they charge fees, they provide protection, or they kidnap migrants and hold them for ransom. It's incredibly lucrative. Chris Dalby from Diami Security Intelligence told Al Jazeera that the CJNG still has the capacity to set half the country on fire. Even wounded, even without El Mencho, they're still powerful. They still have tens of thousands of members. They still control vast territories. They still have enormous financial resources. But he also said that local rivals could now test how far they can go to see if the CJNG gives ground, test their defenses, probe their territories, see if there's weakness, see if they can expand, and if the CJNG responds with violence, which they likely will, that means more fighting, more casualties, more instability. This isn't just a Mexico problem, this is a regional problem. Because the CJNG operates throughout Latin America, they have partnerships with criminal organizations in Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and other countries. They have distribution networks across Central America. They have operations in the Caribbean. The death of El Mencho could trigger a domino effect throughout the region. Former Ecuadorian Army Intelligence Chief Mario Pazmiño told CNN that competition over drug trafficking routes and control of ports from Ecuador could intensify as rival groups try to renegotiate partnerships and control. Ecuador is a major transit point for cocaine coming from Colombia and Peru. The cocaine is produced in those countries, then shipped through Ecuador to Mexico and from Mexico to the United States and other markets. The CJNG has strong connections in Ecuador. They work with local criminal groups. They control shipping routes. But if the CJNG is weakened, if they're distracted by internal fighting, if they lose control of operations, then other groups will try to step in. The Sinaloa cartel will try to establish their own networks in Ecuador. Local Ecuadorian gangs will try to renegotiate terms, maybe demand more money, maybe try to cut out the CJNG entirely and work with other Mexican cartels. And that means violence. In Ecuador, in Colombia, in Central America, drug trafficking is a violent business. And when partnerships break down, when territories are disputed, when money is at stake, people die. So the impact of El Mencho's death isn't limited to Mexico. It ripples throughout the region, throughout the Americas, and ultimately it affects the United States. Because at the end of the day, the reason these cartels exist, the reason they're so powerful, the reason they generate billions of dollars, is because there's a massive market for illegal drugs in the United States. Americans consume enormous amounts of cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, and increasingly fentanyl. The CJNG has been one of the major suppliers of fentanyl to the United States. Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid. It's incredibly potent. A tiny amount can be lethal. And it's been responsible for tens of thousands of overdose deaths in the United States in recent years. The CJNG manufactures fentanyl in clandestine labs in Mexico. They get the precursor chemicals from China. They synthesize the fentanyl. They press it into pills that look like prescription painkillers, or they mix it with heroin, or they sell it as powder, and they smuggle it into the United States by the ton. With El Mencho dead, will the flow of fentanyl stop? Almost certainly not. Chris Dalby put it bluntly. El Mencho's removal is like saying that a company is going to fail because you take out the CEO. Not at all. The flow of drugs is going to continue. And there are going to be plenty of pretenders to the throne, and Mexico is going to have to figure that out. The CJNG is a business. A criminal business, but a business nonetheless. It has infrastructure. It has supply chains. It has laboratories. It has smuggling routes. It has distribution networks in the United States. It has customers. It has revenue streams. All of that doesn't disappear because the CEO is dead. Someone will take over. Maybe one person. Maybe a council of regional commanders sharing power. Maybe different factions controlling different parts of the business. But the business will continue. The drugs will continue to flow. The money will continue to be made. And that's the frustration that many analysts and experts have expressed about the strategy of targeting cartel leaders. It's called the kingpin strategy. You identify the top leaders of criminal organizations and you go after them, arrest them, kill them, remove them from the battlefield. The logic is that without leadership, the organization will collapse. The theory is that these organizations are so dependent on their leaders that removing the leader will cause the whole structure to fall apart. But decades of experience in Mexico and Colombia have shown that this doesn't work. When you remove a leader, the organization doesn't collapse. It fragments, or it reconstitutes under new leadership. And often the violence actually increases because you have internal fighting over succession and external fighting as rivals try to take advantage. Mexico tried this approach under President Felipe Calderón from 2006 to 2012. Calderón launched an all-out war against the cartels. He deployed the military. He went after the leadership. He arrested or killed dozens of high-ranking cartel figures. And what happened? The violence exploded. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed or disappeared during Calderón's presidency and the years that followed. The cartels didn't go away. They fragmented into smaller, more numerous groups. They became more violent as they fought each other. And they adapted, they diversified, they expanded. When the current governing party, Morena, came to power in 2018 under President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, they promised a different approach. López Obrador said, "Abrazos, no balazos." Hugs, not bullets. The idea was to address the root causes of crime: poverty, lack of opportunity, corruption, to invest in social programs, to reduce violence through social policy, not just military force. But that approach was criticized as being too soft on the cartels, as letting them operate with impunity. And violence continued at high levels throughout López Obrador's presidency and into Claudia Sheinbaum's presidency, which began in 2024. And now, with the killing of El Mencho, it appears the Mexican government has returned to the kingpin strategy, targeting the leadership, going after the top guys. With the support and encouragement of the Trump administration in the United States, President Trump has been very vocal about wanting Mexico to crack down on the cartels. He's threatened to designate cartels as terrorist organizations, which would allow the U.S. military to conduct operations in Mexico. He's demanded that Mexico do more to stop the flow of fentanyl. He's made it clear that cartel violence is a top priority for his administration. And the Mexican government, under pressure from the United States, appears to have responded by going after El Mencho. The operation was conducted by Mexican forces, but with U.S. intelligence support. The White House openly acknowledged the U.S. role. This was a joint operation, even if Mexican troops pulled the trigger. But will it work? Will killing El Mencho actually reduce drug trafficking? Will it reduce violence? Will it make Mexico safer? Will it reduce the flow of fentanyl into the United States? History suggests probably not, at least not in the long term. In the short term, there might be some disruption to CJNG operations, some confusion, some internal fighting that distracts them from their business. But in the medium to long term, the organization will adapt. New leadership will emerge. The business will continue. And quite possibly, violence will increase, not decrease, as different factions fight for control and as rivals try to take advantage of the CJNG's temporary weakness. Critics of the kingpin strategy argue that what's really needed is financial strangulation. Go after the money, freeze bank accounts, seize assets, make it impossible for these organizations to move and launder their billions of dollars, cut off their access to the global financial system, make the business unprofitable. But that's much harder than just killing or arresting leaders. It requires international cooperation. It requires sophisticated financial intelligence. It requires going after banks and businesses and individuals who help launder the money. It requires political will to go after potentially powerful people who might have connections to the cartels. It's easier, politically and operationally, to just kill the bad guy, to have a military operation, to announce a victory, to show that you're being tough on crime. But easy doesn't mean effective. So where does this leave us? What can we expect in the coming weeks and months? First, expect more violence in Mexico. The immediate explosion of violence on February 22nd and 23rd is probably not the end. As the CJNG figures out its leadership structure, as different factions jostle for power, as rivals test their defenses, there will be more fighting, more roadblocks, more attacks, more casualties. Second, expect the Mexican government to continue operations against the CJNG and other cartels. Security Secretary Omar Garcia Harfuch said authorities would remain very attentive to any restructuring within the cartel. They've shown they can get intelligence on cartel leadership. They've shown they can conduct successful operations. They'll likely try to press their advantage. Go after other CJNG commanders while the organization is in disarray. Third, expect the Sinaloa cartel and other rivals to try to expand their territory. This is an opportunity they won't pass up. The CJNG's weakest moment in years. Time to take territory. Time to take control of smuggling routes. Time to assert dominance. Fourth, expect impacts on the flow of migrants to the U.S. border. When violence increases in Mexico, people flee. They leave their homes. They try to get to safety. Many will try to cross into the United States. We've seen this before. Violence in western Mexico in recent years displaced tens of thousands of people. Some of them ended up at the U.S. border seeking asylum. In January 2022, the Associated Press reported that cartel violence in western Mexico displaced 35,000 people, highlighting fighting between CJNG and local rivals in Michoacán. Tony Payan, director of the Claudio X. Gonzalez Center for the U.S. and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute, told CalMatters, "There might be a spike in violence in border states, and that's dangerous because even though the violence has never really spilt across into the United States, it is happening right on the border. It puts everybody on edge." Fifth, expect this to be an issue in the 2026 World Cup. Mexico is co-hosting with the United States and Canada. Guadalajara is a host city. The images of burning vehicles and violence in Guadalajara just months before the World Cup are terrible optics. FIFA will be concerned. Teams will be concerned. Fans will be concerned. The Mexican government will be under enormous pressure to ensure security. Analyst David Mora from the International Crisis Group noted that the operation comes at a consequential time for Mexico, with the World Cup approaching and Guadalajara scheduled to host matches. And sixth, expect the flow of drugs into the United States to continue, because as long as there's demand, there will be supply. As long as Americans are willing to pay for cocaine and fentanyl and methamphetamine, someone will provide it. The CJNG, the Sinaloa cartel, some new organization that emerges from the chaos. The business is too profitable to stop. El Mencho is dead, but the problem he represented isn't solved. The CJNG he built isn't destroyed. The drug trade he facilitated isn't ended. The violence his organization perpetrated isn't over. In many ways, his death might make things worse before they get better, because power vacuums in criminal organizations lead to violence. Competition for control leads to casualties, and the people who suffer most are not the cartel leaders who have armed guards and armored vehicles. It's ordinary Mexicans who live in areas controlled by these groups, who can't leave their homes when the roadblocks go up, who lose their businesses when violence scares away customers, who bury their loved ones when they get caught in the crossfire. This is not a victory. This is a chapter. A bloody chapter in Mexico's ongoing war with organized crime. A war that has been going on for decades. A war that has claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. A war that shows no signs of ending anytime soon. Nemesio Rubén Oseguera Cervantes, El Mencho, is dead. Killed by Mexican military forces in the mountains of Jalisco on February 22, 2026. One of the most wanted men in the world. One of the most powerful drug lords in history. Gone. But the Jalisco New Generation Cartel lives on. Wounded. Disrupted. But alive. And dangerous. Very dangerous. And Mexico, the United States, and Latin America will be dealing with the consequences of El Mencho's death for months and years to come. This is the story of how El Mencho died, and how his death might have just made everything worse.